Good morning, people. It's early down here on the river, just a little before sunrise. Fall weather has settled in. I'm going to spend most of the day today out in my new little inflatable, ripping up and down the river, doing a little exploring. You've seen a little video of that. That's been fun. But anyway, I want to continue the conversation that we started in the last video about the key to finding freedom, because it is an issue that I find very, very important and very often neglected. And again, while in the popular mind, and we hear it all the time, there's all this conversation about, that you've got to know what it is you want, and you got to know what it is that you don't want. But there's very little conversation about the you that does the wanting. And unless the you is developed enough and self-aware enough to actually know what you want and know what you don't want, then seeking things that you just merely think you might, because perhaps they seem superficially attractive to you, that's a fool's errand, and it's tremendously dangerous, and it ruins a tremendous number of lives. Especially in this day and age of seemingly endless opportunity for diversion, consumption, endless advertisement with people waggling enticing things in front of your face and promising all of this, all very eager to take your money. If it was just your money, that money comes from someplace. It comes from your life. It's something we need to discuss in great detail and really get solid. Now, I have to tell you that this is going to be a difficult and contrarian view, and it comes from precisely my experience of being a young man, being brought up in a small town with my dad being the local undertaker, and having the intimate knowledge of the stories that I was told by elderly people at the ends of their lives. And in that brief moment of honesty, they would disclose to you what they really thought, which is something that people almost never, ever do. And the reason they don't is that they have invested so much of their life in something that was foolish and unsatisfying and contrary to their own nature. To actually admit that is not something that very many people ever develop the courage to do so unless they are in their last hours of life. And having been there and having heard it again and again, believe me, I'm fully aware that most people live lives, as it's said, of quiet desperation, not success, in spite of how it might look to the rest of us. And this shouldn't really surprise us. There is a old story of some of the early acts, I believe, of the Barnum and Bailey Circus project a century or so ago, where they had a feature where on the sign outside of the feature it says, "Come see the horse where its head where its ass should be." Okay? And people would line up to see this completely peculiar, disfigured horse that had its head where its ass should be. And when they went into the stall to see the horse, they simply saw that the horse was in the stall backwards. But they had paid their, nickel to get in there to see it, and most people felt so silly about being suckered by something like that simple, that very few people admitted on the outside that what they'd done is been taken advantage of and been suckered. And the circus got away with that for years and years and years because they were able to exploit the curiosity of the individual and their dishonesty in admitting that they'd failed. And good God, do we see that everywhere. Rarely are you going to hear from somebody that they bought a $500 bottle of wine and it wasn't worth $500. Or they bought a big fancy house on the hill and it wasn't any more satisfying than the place that they used to rent when they were a kid living downtown. Or that they bought a ridiculously expensive car and that they enjoyed driving it 10 times as much as the old beater that they used to have. Almost never does anyone ever admit that, because they have invested so much in chasing those objects that to admit that it wasn't worth it is not something that people have the courage to do. In fact, what they typically do is really talk their game up. And this is why it becomes such a dangerous, self-reinforcing feedback loop for so many people, because we see the people taking pictures of themselves, driving their silly fancy cars to their silly big fancy houses, taking pictures of themselves, smiling, looking like they're successful and happy and all that stuff, making a fabulous show of how successful they are in getting what they want. But we should contemplate, is that behavior the kind of behavior that you would anticipate someone who is satisfied would actually engage in? Or is it obviously the neurotic display of an individual who knows that they have squandered their life and their resources on silly material trappings that didn't even get close to addressing their real needs and their real wants? Look, it's very easy to explain how this goes. Just like this, because I can remember these impulses myself. Here you are, a gawky 19-year-old kind of hick kid with thick glasses from a small town, thoughtful sort, lonely, alienated, not adept with female company. But somewhere in there, kind of unrecognized in your self that isn't well understood, you have a desire for connection and for intimacy and for a sense of adventure. Those are real needs. But you see the advertisement for a brand new 911 Targa Porsche, okay? And you see the guy driving that car, and he looks like he's successful. And obviously, the hot blonde who's riding along there with him thinks he is successful, and she's all too eager to give him her intimacy. So it's quite easy to come to the conclusion that, if this young guy were to go out and buy himself this ridiculously expensive car, that somehow he would find himself in possession of the image of success, of status, and he would, through the mechanism of owning that vehicle, then actually get, although he doesn't understand this, intimacy and connection and perhaps a sense of adventure. But of course that won't work. In order to acquire that Porsche, what it means is lots of time and effort, working your ass off, making money, neglecting other aspects of your life that might be ridiculously more fruitful and satisfying, might be far more conducive to finding intimacy, connection, and adventure than saving up the money for a Porsche. In fact, a young guy like that could spend a decade, perhaps the best decade of his life, piddling it away to get a car with a limited lifespan. By the time he actually achieves it, it means very little to him. Every other Tom, Dick, and Harry that was equally as insecure as he was has done the same, so there's really no status to be found whatsoever in owning one of those. I mean, they're common as peanuts. But he has squandered a tremendous amount of his life, a quarter of his productive life, perhaps the best years of his life, seeking unconsciously intimacy, connection, and a sense of adventure, precisely through denying himself those things. He has wasted a quarter of his productive adulthood chasing an object that didn't provide that for him. In fact, the opportunity stole it from him. But he was persuaded because somewhere there he saw an image of somebody who looked like they were successful and looked like they were getting affirmation and looked like they had status and connection. He saw that in a picture someplace. Well, and the rest was history. In Nordic tradition, which resonates with me, probably because of my seafaring tendencies. Certainly I'm the kind of guy that does pay a certain amount of homage to Njord, and he looks after me in my life in the realm of boats. But certainly the idea that the gods conspire and they get together and they get drunk and they make bets with each other on how they can screw up the lives of mortals the most. That explains a lot, I think. But one of the most evil curses that has ever come from the gods in their most destructive moment is this: to grant a fool success in what they want. Because the fool doesn't know what they want. And if you can give them success in chasing something that they think they want, but is contrary to their real needs, you have destroyed their life entirely. And I understand that that's very savage, but it doesn't hurt to take that to heart. Maybe you will get off relatively easy and only squander a quarter of your productive adulthood chasing a Porsche or a new pickup truck, rather than all of it chasing something bigger and even more foolish. And perhaps if you're actually very fortunate, God help you, you will have no success whatsoever in pursuing any of those silly things, and you'll be forced to contemplate this stuff earlier. Having that mediocre success and chasing what you don't want is, in fact, one of the worst curses that you could ever find yourself being subject to. It lays a lot of people low. So being warned of that, the key to finding this freedom, again, is first having a very deep internal conversation about what it is you, specifically the you are, want. And let's be clear, it's never an object. What you want will never be an object. It will be an emotional need. Now, there are objects that may suffice in being a vehicle to provide that emotional need. It's not an absolute thing. But they are not a surrogate for the emotional thing. The Porsche doesn't equal status. The Porsche doesn't equal intimacy. The Porsche doesn't equal success. It's a surrogate placeholder for those things. If I actually want those things, there may be far better ways of going about getting them than chasing after a Porsche. Of course. So knowing what it is that you want, which is never a thing, it'll be an emotional need. Surely, again, sometimes objects can be that vehicle to getting that need met, yes, but only incidentally. Interestingly enough, the kinds of things that you really don't want mostly are material things. And why? Because they are obstacles, barriers, anchors, restrictions, very typically, from not only you investigating the you that you are, but in fact chasing after the emotional needs that you truly do need to meet. And so often we get that completely backwards. We think what we want in this age of advertising, and not by accident, is stuff. And we think the things we don't want are emotional needs. In fact, in reality, it's precisely the opposite. But knowing that, well, wouldn't sell a lot of product. Freedom begets freedom. Freedom is not a destination, it's a path. You are only as free as you happen to be. And that changes as you learn and become more conscious and evolve and become more self-aware. The needs that you might have felt as a young person likely won't change a great deal as you move through life, but your skill in getting those needs met, if you are diligent, well, that can be radically advanced. And as well, your ability to evade the obstacles that stand in the way of your freedom to be, you get far better at evading those too. But we have to be very cautious of the individuals, like I say, who have bought the $500 bottle of wine and are embarrassed by being suckered and are unwilling to admit that it wasn't worth it. All too often those individuals are doing their best to not only camouflage their mistake, but recoup some costs, often at your expense. Now, this is very simple stuff. Your needs are simple. They can be met immediately if you are willing to acknowledge them for what they are, and to then act upon that knowledge. I mean, what is freedom if it is not acting upon knowledge? It takes honesty, intelligence, courage, and the ability to act, to be a free person. Let's embrace that path ourselves and elevate those that we find who feel the same, all right? Cheers.